Durdana, please feel free.
Okay, thank you so much for having me here. I really appreciate you guys inviting me for this. And I'm Durdana Farid. I'm working for an organization called Leaping Boundaries that works with the visibility of madrasa girls. And I'm also a part of a collective called Lokal Tubitaloy that does political writings in the form of intervention. There's more to it, but I guess I'll keep it short. Thanks. That's all.
Hi, everybody. My name is Umama, and I work at Kotha with Ahir, and I'm also working as a researcher in at Power and Participation Research Institute, also Dhaka-based, and I am mostly focusing on the intersection between gender and economics, and I do research on issues like urban economics and poverty. But yeah, a lot of my time and effort goes into kind of building Kotha and Kotha's presence and projects. So yeah, thank you, Ahir, for having me.
Okay, so today we're here for Feminine Rage. Woohoo! Okay, so in this particular episode, we want to touch on how feminine rage has shaped social movements, shaped discourse, shaped politics, influenced politics, birthed several social movements, and especially how we women and gender diverse people, we hold rights and we take a lot of them for granted, how those rights, we only have those rights because somewhere, someday, one of us decided to get furious. So when I talk about feminine rage, to kind of define it, one quote that I really, really like was said by Soraya Chemaly. She wrote in her book, Rage Becomes Her, that anger has a profound purpose. It is a moral smoke signal alerting us to inequality and injustice. So I feel like when we talk about feminine rage or anger in general, that's something that comes up. And I wanted to start off this episode just talking about what feminine rage is to us. What is it? Why is it important? So yeah, I feel like that quote does a good job of it, of showing anger as a constructive response to the injustice that we face. Do you guys want to add to it, add your own, like talk about your own version of it?
Yeah, I think before talking about what feminine rage means to me, I also just want to just talk about the fact that anger as an emotion is gendered in the world that we live in. And when we talk about gendered emotion, what does that mean? It means we associate anger as an emotion only with certain groups or certain types of people, and that's usually masculine people. And so women or gender diverse people, or those who identify themselves as femme, they don't have access to this emotion. That's not to say that we don't feel it, that we don't have a right to feel it. That's to say that we are not allowed to express it when we do feel it. So I think that's and in a society where likability and desirability are such big factors for women particularly, we kind of equate anger and rage with something that reduces that desirability and that actually acts as a block to a lot of opportunities that we might have access to if we present ourselves as desirable, and that is to present ourselves as not angry people. And the same if we look at the other side of men or masculine people, when they express anger, it is seen as a source of power. It is seen as something that helps them climb up ladders, whether that's social ladders, whether that's ladders in the workplace, whatever you want to call it. So we see that the same emotion, it's the same emotion, but depending on who's expressing it, who's feeling it, we as a society have a very different response to it. And I think that's kind of one of the reasons that this conversation is so important, is because we don't see it as just an emotion. We see it as something very politically charged. So yeah, I think for me, feminine rage would be Okay, I feel like I've already talked too much. So, Durdana, please go ahead. I think my it was embedded in the answer that what feminine rage is to me.
I think you've said most of what I was going to say as well.
Sorry.
So no, it's okay. I don't have much to say, but I will actually touch upon the point that even when there is feminine rage going on in different spheres, like the private sphere and the public sphere, and workplace, household, political spheres, a lot of it is shunned depending on who is showing that anger, like you said. So the questions we need to be able to ask about anger or rage is whose anger are we talking about? Who is allowed to be angry and in what spaces, and whose anger is accounted for by the society? Of course, feminine anger is not, but we need to ask ourselves at this point in time that isn't all kinds of anger, especially anger from marginalized voices, um, under which feminine anger falls. So I agree with your definition actually, that feminine anger could be anger expressed by not just women, but gender non-conforming folks, folks who identify as femmes, and all of that. So we need to be able to ask the question that if we are not taking into account these feminine rage, then how is change going to happen regarding discourse about feminist issues? Because in history, we've seen that a lot of feminine rage has helped shape a lot of social problems, and the kinds of things that are accepted now in our modern day society has been a result of this feminine rage.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just to add to that, also, I feel like I talked about the fact that feminine rage is something that is suppressed and something that's not allowed to kind of be free. But at the same time, we also see like it's simultaneously something that is like people simultaneously invalidate feminine rage, but at the same time also presume its existence where it does not exist. So something like রাস্তা দিয়ে হেঁটে যাওয়ার সময় হাসতেছো না কেন, like why don't you have like a nice smile, why aren't you smiling back at strangers who are smiling at you? Or if we think about like within families, why aren't you always the one that's like you know happy and
Cheering
charming,
everybody up.
not taking that emotional burden on to kind of keep everyone happy. So ওই জিনিসগুলোতে where it's not anger but it's standing up for your rights or it's setting boundaries, that's equated with anger when we're not painting it as anger, or we don't consider it anger. So simultaneously we see that it's they invalidate it when we do have anger and we want to express it, and then they also kind of presume it when it's not there, which is frustrating, but interesting. So I just wanted to like add that.
I think that's also in line with likability, right? Like society in general has this image of women that they should be these smiling, nurturing, super soft people who don't really get angry. And even when women do get angry, we keep talking about invalidating. So like, what does it look like? It looks like telling a girl she's hysterical because she's mad when she's mad for valid reasons. It's kind of reducing the emotion that we have for valid reasons. I mean, we face injustice, or we're mad, and we're allowed to be mad. We're obviously mad because something happened, right? But to kind of reduce that emotion to being overly emotional or hysterical, it's just
Or PMSing.
it's
No,
very frustrating.
We're not constantly PMSing.
Oh
exactly.
yeah, that's another thing. PMSing.
আরেকটা another interesting quote that comes to mind when we're having this conversation is, and will add like in the subtitles here somewhere where this quote is from because I don't remember, but it's the fact that anger and like rationality are not mutually exclusive. And I feel like especially when it's feminine rage, people try to make those two things mutually exclusive. That if you're angry, you're irrational. Yeah, like Ahir said, you're hysterical, you're overreacting, you're dramatic, just chachacho, you know, like it's like the minute that you are taking power over that emotion and you're expressing it, then we don't want to listen to anything that you have to say because you probably don't have anything good to say in the first place. So yeah. So and I think Durdana brought up a good point about like public and private sphere. And Achker episode, I think we do want to kind of talk about anger in the private and public slash political sphere. So do you want to just talk about what exactly we mean by that?
Yeah, when I first came across the topic and I saw that the private and the political were different, I found it a bit problematic, this binary making of the two spheres, because I think the political and the private are constantly informing and sort of affecting each other. So there is this kind of fluidity. And, you know, feminists have been using the slogan, the personal is political, for many years. And there is a reason why. A lot of the private things that are happening in our households and when they're put together collectively, makes it a shared experience for the rest of the people living in the households in our society or in a country or in a region. Um, so I think that certain discussions around, say, unpaid labor done by women in the household, domestic violence, and then all kinds of problems that arise in patriarchal families. And our family structures are inherently patriarchal, like sexism, lookism, etc. And also that like every other problem that arises from family and is having a gendered effect on its members are individual and private experiences, but together they are informing us about the political scenario of all these people's lives or the social scenario of all these people's lives. And that sort of instantly dismisses the idea that, you know, the private and the political or the public are separate. They're not. Our collective experiences is what informing the political scenario of our lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I heard. Did you have anything to add to that?
No, basically, what she said. I feel like it's just our individual nuanced interactions in our workplaces, in our homes, all of these that we call private, like private when we refer to private. It also kind of informs us that there is a system of patriarchy that exists, that it's not just, you know, these isolated incidents, but how society has systematic patriarchy ingrained in it, and that is also a bridge between our private experiences and the overall political conversations.
Yeah, just to break down on one of the examples that Durdana brought up of domestic violence. So I'm sure everybody, like no one can deny you know, domestic violence is an just gender-based violence in general is an epidemic in Bangladesh, but domestic violence is something that has a lot of prominence in the public discourse, etc. But at the same time, there's this idea or this notion যে, you know, husband wife এর মধ্যে যা হয় ওটা বাড়ির বিষয়, like ওটা বাড়িতে হয়, বাড়িতেই থাকবে, ওইটা নিয়ে কেন বাইরে আমরা ডিসকাস করছি? Like this is a private personal matter, not a social cultural matter. And the fact that in order to fight it, we need to recognize the fact that it is social and cultural and not private and personal is like this whole debate of not isolating these two issues. যে unless you can accept যে এটা শুধু এই লোকেশনে এই বাড়িতে এই married coupleর সাথে হচ্ছে না, this is happening across the country, not only just the country but the region and across the globe, and it happens in very specific patterns, and it's always you know, specific perpetrators of the violence, it has specific perpetrators, the violence, and it also has specific survivors of the violence. So if it's like the same pattern across time and space, then we can't view it as isolated events from, you know, one family to another family. We have to view it as a larger social problem. And I think that's exactly what feminists have tried to do since you know, since the beginning, that, you know, what happens at our homes is something that we need to talk about on the streets in order to bring change. So yeah, I think that's a very important distinction to make before we go ahead with the conversation. Okay, so I think the next question that we can maybe tackle is, who is allowed to be angry, or, when is feminine rage legitimized or accepted?
So, when we talk about who is allowed to be angry, the first thing that comes to mind, since we've been talking about this so much, is the idea of brown men. How when the anger is directed towards another class of men, they're fine with it. So I think the first thing that we can do, the first thing that we can talk about to answer this question is, who is this anger directed towards? If it's directed towards, for example, people of lower working class, for example, rickshaws on the street, or people on the street, I think if we complain about something like that to our relative or our friends, they find it easy to accept our anger, that okay, because the anger is towards those people, to the people that they kind of alienate themselves from, or they think of themselves as higher beings from those people. But the moment in time that anger is directed towards them by one of their friends, by their relatives, when they're being told, we are angry because you did this, something you did wasn't right or sexist, that is when they lose it. That is when they can't accept this anger at all.
Yeah, like Mane, I have unfortunately sat in on conversations where in the same breath they will say যে হ্যাঁ, eve teasing এত বড় একটা সমস্যা, and women, like bus conductors এত বাজে হয়, there's like so much violence that women face, but they don't realize that it is the same conversation when we are bringing up when we are bringing up them not respecting, them violating consent in personal relationships. So they don't realize it's part of the same conversation when they are they are verbally abusing their wives or girlfriends, and they don't realize it's part of the same conversation when I can come up with lots of examples, but the fact that there is such such a distinction between those two types of violence that for us is like very clearly directly connected, but for them it's just like parallel, never meets each other. And so that's like yeah, that's just something that is like I've noticed everywhere. Durdana, did you have anything to add to like this?
Yeah, I think Ahir's example is a very good way of demonstrating how anger is also very classist. So if a bourgeois person is showing anger, who belongs to an upper middle class, or who belongs to the upper middle class or the upper class, it's accepted anger. But when poorer people are shouting about their basic rights or complaining about the state violence, it's not okay. It's somehow, it's so easy to not take account of their anger. So that brings to the question, that raises the question, like what kind of anger is accounted for by the state, by the institutions, and by the law. This, I think, a good example would be to talk about rape and sexual harassment. Like, in Bangladesh, there is a general practice, or it's not practice, but there is a general sort of way things work in the legal system, like how people who have been charged with rape or sexual harassment is never brought to trial, or even if they are, they're either let go because they're a powerful party, or they just ছাড়া পেয়ে যায় আর কি, হ্যাঁ. So a lawlessness it tends to make people more angry, and yet our law and order and institutions are not paying any heed to such anger that is coming up from these people. And similarly, and I've seen these coming up online and in social media a lot, like feminism niye kotha bolle keno feministra to chillaye, why are they always mad about things, why do they hate men, and all of this anger, and gets a lot of validation from other men, or there are patriarchal women as well, I'm not gonna lie. There are women who have who stand in powerful positions and they say that I think it's okay for garments workers to not get paid more than this. I think it's okay that after they've been protesting in the streets for days, their salaries just raised by like 25 taka, 26 taka per month. They find this absolutely okay. And there are women who are belonging to similar classes who are supporting that patriarchal women. But we forget that, ignoring certain kind of anger is also oppression. Ignoring certain kind of anger is also social violence.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, because when we talked about Ahir Jokhon, you kind of said that, read that quote out, and we said, feminine rage has been the start of so many political movements, and political movements are movements against injustice. So, ওই জিনিসটাকে suppress করা মানে you're trying to ensure that things that are in place right now, which are oppressing that group of people, do remain in place. Yeah. And anything more on like the initial point of like men accepting anger?
I
Also,
feel like
Ahir,
although we say, yeah.
no, go ahead.
Okay, so I feel like although we say that men accept these kinds of anger, like when it's towards other men, a lot of times it's more of men being angry on behalf of us, like being angry for us. They're like, because we are their women, or because being angry isn't our job. Yeah, we face the if teasing and all of that, we face that, but being angry in response to that, that's not our job, that's their job. So they're angry for
Yeah.
us.
Yeah.
So it's not entirely fair to say they accept our anger.
Yeah.
A lot of times they see themselves as these protectors. This is making me laugh because it sounds so ridiculous when I say it out loud. But yeah, a lot of times they feel like they have a job to be angry for us because we are not supposed to be angry, and because they're our protectors and they're the good guys, nice men.
Yeah, and I noticed yeah, it's the whole issue of like otherizing perpetrators of violence. It's the faceless man in the alley. It's like, it's the bus conductor who is never going to be part of your own community or social network. It's always someone else out there and not me in here. And I was going to say something else. I forgot. Okay, it'll come back to me later.
Yeah, but on that point, I think I can stretch that a little more. Like, when the perpetrator is coming from the same class as yours, you don't accept them as a perpetrator, but if they belong to a different class.
Exactly.
Like you said, it's so easy to point out that, okay, a rickshaw puller or a bus conductor or a bus driver is a sex predator, but it's so hard to accept when it's my own brother, like when it's a man's brother or a man's uncle, which is why a lot of families like just hide the identity of the sex predator, and they would never do for years. They know that maybe their kid has been molested by this person, but for years they will keep that as a family secret. It's an open secret, everybody knows about it, but nobody would talk about it. And just by the sheer sort of position that that person holds in the family, they're absolved of this crime that they've committed.
Exactly. And speaking of like, holding power within, not as part of like a political party, not as, CEO of a company, but within like families and social networks, like you said, if it's like if it's the rich uncle that is the decision maker for the family, or even if we look at like friend groups in like schools, then the popular athlete who's like nice to everybody. If there was rage against that character, then it would not be accepted. And we know it's not a hypothetical situation. We have so many examples from our immediate people of the anger being denied because of who it is directed towards. So definitely. Yeah, so I think we
feel like they don't even have to be that charismatic.
Yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, I feel like they don't even have to be that popular kid or whatever. It's just there's this weird Roko thing that whenever rage is against one of your kind, you have to stand up for them, you have to take their side, you have to protect them from certain repercussions that they might face. It's just this unsafe thing. A lot of times, for example, a lot of really toxic ideals exist in locker room banter, right? But those guys continue to like kind of keep it to themselves or like, you know, protect their bros. So it really doesn't have to be someone who's popular or a good friend. It can be honestly just a man, and they will feel the need to kind of victim blame or redirect the accusations coming towards those men.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So I think we covered quite a bit under the question of, you know, who it is directed towards. So if we move on to, you know, who is it coming from, and we touched a little bit on this in the beginning, but if we talk about who is it coming from, actually, are we willing to listen, and are we willing to, you know, give a chance to the feminine rage?
I don't think any feminine rage is given any chance unless, you know, you're a cishet woman with holding a lot of power. Money, at least I haven't seen. There are lots of women in my family, and I don't see their rage being accounted for. It's like the last decision my dad gives. That's it. That's what's happening in the house. Because, you know, I said it. I don't care. It might be your experience, but the last word is mine. So,
Yeah.
which is why I think a lot of gender non-conforming folks' stories don't get acknowledged, because typically they're so angry about whatever injustice that's happening. There's so little acceptability of gender non-conforming femmes and feminine appearing gender non-conforming folks, but none of that gets accounted for or listened to. Like, they don't have people to listen to what they have to say about themselves or their gender or their sexuality, and they don't have spaces to talk about their experiences at all. And the state criminalizing them, and we us, like the cis heteronormative society, considering their behavior to be illegitimate or like not, you know, not normal. All of it comes in a package, and they're so filled with rage, but there's nobody to listen to them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I heard
I
you.
think when you bring up how we don't listen to them, a lot of other groups also come to mind. Like, you know, who is allowed to be angry? I think we can also answer that question. I mean, I think you answered that question. We don't listen. These people aren't allowed to be angry. Women who are like super vocal and don't conform to the norms, for example, who's not socially, I'd say, modest, or who doesn't come from, for example, a really educated family, or who doesn't come from like a higher class in society. I think it's easier, like, I think we don't allow them to be angry. I mean, it's true, yeah, feminine rage is not accepted anywhere, but even then there are layers to who is allowed to be angry. I feel like, as you said, there are certain groups of people, certain groups of vulnerable people, certain minorities who find it even harder to think about being angry.
Yeah. Yeah, Mane, when you were talking about like modest, like in our context, it would be like the bhalo mein, right? And the bhalo mein like even they even when they are speaking about things that are not okay, not right, they will say it in a certain way. They will use a certain language that will not be vulgar. They will, as you said, mention they will come from. They will have a family, a well-standing family society that will back them in their anger. And we don't
It's
have
like very measured anger,
very measured.
protective sort of anger.
Mm-hmm.
That
And Mana, if we think about how we, sorry, could you
Yeah,
hold?
go on.
Yeah, no, I was going to bring up the point of like Mane, another dimension of people who are kind of who are almost demonized by society would be unmarried women in Bangladesh, right? So if an unmarried woman who does not have like a father or a husband who is who is backing them in their anger, and they're just being vocal about issues and injustices to themselves and to other people like them, then automatically that is questioning their modesty, that is questioning their morality, that is questioning their character. And so, Mane, you have to have all of those things in place and then some before you can open your mouth and know that, okay, people will maybe listen to me and not just, start calling me names and start dehumanizing me.
I can think of some
I think that's
activists.
to say when your feminism isn't something that makes men comfortable. Like feminism isn't supposed to please men. It's for the system that puts them above in the very beginning. So I think all of those women, a lot of times they fall under the category of like talking about things that make men uncomfortable, that don't conform to men's ideas of how feminism should look like. Because I don't know, I feel like a lot of times men don't even realize that we can be angry or it's a justified response. They'll call it, they'll say that we're passionate. Or we're very emotionally attached or anything. So because they can't even identify the fact that these women can be angry, it's kind of hard for this group of women to be angry. And also, yeah, unmarried women who choose to not have children, I think that's also a very
Yeah, so essentially you have to be from a Muslim family, Muslim upper class family. You have to have graduated from a reputable institution. You have had if you are above the age of 23, then okay, 1 second. So basically, you have to be a Muslim girl from an upper class family, educated parents, more points if they have PhDs, if you have graduated from a well reputable high school and university. If you're above the age of 20, then you have kids and you're married to another person from upper class. And if you have all of those things and you're straight, all of those things are like checked and in place, then okay, maybe we'll give you 5 seconds to speak about whatever you're whining about. That's essentially where
Yeah, it's still 5 seconds though, right? She doesn't get all the time. Yeah, I think that's an important point. I mean, it's funny, but it's also sad how we don't understand. Sorry, I'm pointing my fan.
No, that's fine.
Sorry, a patta ketu diyo.
It's fine. It's fine.
Umama just gave us an excuse to edit here and there. Acha. So the point I was trying to say was that, it's just 5 seconds they get to sort of their anger and their rage, and then that's just it. It's also sad how we don't talk about or we don't know about the struggles of these women who are coming from rich families, because they have their own set of struggles. And, with rich people, holding on to their honor, just like a middle-class Muslim family, is so important because they're rich and they've established a certain hierarchy in society. They don't want to compromise that by letting their girls' anger away or letting some problem that is unspeakable get away from within their, tight-knit family members. So upper class men especially can be very protective of their women, as in their sisters or their wives. So in many ways, we don't get to hear the voices of those women either, or their anger.
Yeah. I hear you were saying something, and I think I cut you off. When
I lost it.
When I was thinking about the perfect identity of the angry woman.
All right. Yeah, I think I said that later. Like, if they're feminists, their feminism is also kind of convoluted to the where it validates men or don't make them uncomfortable. Plus, I feel like they're complicit with a lot of sexist ideals as well, which perhaps they don't consider sexist in the first place, but well, they are.
And this is a good point that you bring up, because Mane, I think we know the idea of the good feminist versus the bad feminist, and the good feminist is someone who doesn't push the boundary that much. And again, like it's measured, it's restricted, but it's also about like who is the feminist, and it kind of also, I think we should talk about like what is the feminist cause that this feminist is fighting for, or what are the feminist issues that this feminist is talking about, and which feminist causes are you allowed to be angry and vocal about, and which ones are you not, and especially like given, let's say, like Bangladesh's context, what would you guys say, what are some of the causes?
I would say rights to education, and then in certain classes, women being allowed to, study up to a certain point before they get married. And if they don't want to have children, they're even allowed time to think about it. Those are some of the privileges that we have bought sort of with our feminist currency. But that came through so much struggle of so many women. We do need to look at the fact that if we historically trace women's struggles, our achievements are all rooted in the struggles of those women from previous generations. There are so many important women's contributions in our literature, in our politics, in our social movements, in our social activism. There's no way of denying it. And the kinds of feminist issues that we're not allowed to be angry still about would be women's sexuality. Like, oh, women don't need to get pleasure out of sex. They don't have to talk about it. Like, why? So there is so much still that needs to be done via our feminist movement, that needs to be addressed when we're in the streets or when we're talking in such public platforms about. But by recognizing the fact that, the achievements that we have gathered so far politically and economically and socially for women has been a part of the previous generation's struggle.
Exactly.
So, and this we need to take up as our struggle. These issues that we're not allowed to talk about is a part of our struggle that we must talk about in order to normalize these things for the next generation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like even something as basic as, I feel like especially Bangladesh, we didn't really need to fight for this. It was just in our constitution from the beginning. Women were allowed to vote, and that's fine, and that's the normal that we were born into. But it wasn't that long ago that women's voting rights were a topic of debate and discussion, and the feminists of that era were, they had the same arguments thrown at them. They had the angry feminist trope back then. They had, you are ruining your family, you are just rocking the boat a little too much.
Honor.
Yeah, honor, like why do you need voting rights? Like you're just staying at home. So it's not like the arguments against feminism or feminine rage are anything new. They're as old as feminism itself. And yeah, so, and like speaking of like education, um Ahir, I think you had some points about who are the people that worked for women's education in Bangladesh, and what did their kind of fight look like, and how even their fight is kind of rooted in feminism.
So before that, I just wanted to add to something that you said earlier about our voting rights. So it's really interesting because we can hammer down on the fact that really anger is something that brings change, because these women, they didn't get their voting rights easy. When the suffragettes took place, these women were like setting fires to property. They were angry. They were heckling politicians. They were again, the quote that you brought up, that anger and rationality, they aren't mutually exclusive. They were writing articles, literature, pieces, time and time again about why they should get those rights. But more importantly, what really got to me was that they were downright vandalizing property. They were angry, and that is why we got something like voting rights that we take for granted to this day. We think it's such a, we were born into it. It's a normal thing, and we don't need feminism anymore. But at some point it wasn't normal, and women had to go out with stakes to make it normal. About the education thing, so yeah, I was reading up on it for this episode, and I saw someone, a feminist icon, Begum Rokeya, we credit her for empowering women and opening the doors for girls getting education. But we also kind of don't see the fact that she came from from an educated family, from an upper class family. Her family was educated. Her family was able to grant her certain privileges, and in that regard, even in that time frame, her anger was more legitimate than other people's anger. Like even someone like Begum Rokeya had that privilege, and that also goes with what Durdana was saying, that when it's poor people or poor women getting angry, we don't really hear those stories. We don't have those ideas because we don't validate that anger. And that's why even the root of all of that empowerment, that was from someone who had those opportunities to begin with.
Yeah.
That's not to say she didn't have her fair share of struggles, because she was ultimately someone who was a woman. But I feel like that's an interesting point of reflection, because we never really, for example, we were taught all of these in our textbooks, but we were never really made to think about the fact that she had certain privileges and advantages to be able to go out and do that someone from a poor family would be just entirely shunned out if they'd done it.
And I feel like somehow, even though we hold her as like an icon of empowerment, she's somehow removed from like the women's rights activism scene, or like just the women's rights movement, even though literally she wrote a book on the feminist utopia where she broke down gender roles. Like that is the root of what feminist causes are about, and somehow we're able to remove her from that and only keep like the sanitized version of like, let's everyone should be educated, and that's like
Yeah.
it still keeps everything else more or less in place. And so I find that interesting. And speaking of like causes, Durdana mentioned sexuality and just bodily autonomy in general, about just rights over what is happening with our body, access to contraception, or just um, demanding that people respect our consent and demanding that we get to live free from violence. These are issues that organizations like Nari Boko has been working with, and they have been the target of a lot of hate because they've been angry women on the streets fighting for sex workers' rights, fighting for bodily autonomy, and fighting against violence against women. And I find that that's just very, very clear to us exactly what the boundaries are of what's acceptable to be angry about and what's not.
Yeah, this also brings to mind, like, indigenous voices are also very marginalized. There's so much anger because there's generation of militarization in our hills and our hill tracts. And what makes me really sad is we don't even know these folks. We're so far away that we don't even know their narratives or their stories or what they have to say. And, I feel really mad at people who, being Bengali Muslims, knowing that Bengali Muslims have been settling there and have been sort of evicting them from their own lands and from their own livelihoods, they are never talking about, like, there's no, for most heteronormative, cis heteronormative feminists, there's no intersectional public discussion, or they don't, they never really deal with such stuff in their feminist politics and in their feminist realities. It's as if the indigenous rage doesn't even exist, and their struggles are so invisible to us.
Yeah. And Mane, I feel like, and you were speaking about this when we talked about like class, like even women from upper class, they're facing injustices within their own circles and networks of men who are in their circles, but they're not facing the other forms of oppression that comes with class that women from working class are facing. And then when we look at indigenous women, we have indigenous men and men from their own communities. And then we also have Bangali settlers and Bangali armies that are perpetrators of violence against them. So it's just, coming from inside and out. And, those should be, that is a feminine rage that we should all be hearing loudly, but we don't get to.
Yeah. I think if we trace, actually, like shift this conversation a little bit into South Asia's history, if now is the right time.
Yeah.
The first example leading to my argument about indigenous women comes to mind would be Kalpana Chakma, who was abducted in 1996. And it's been 23 years. There hasn't been any proper trial, albeit, or there hasn't been any hearing from the court, albeit her brother and family have been able to identify the perpetrators of who abducted her. And Kalpana Chakma is a perfect example of how feminine rage, it was not accepted and it still is not. She started talking about the the killings, the sexual harassment, and the violence that indigenous women especially face by the state or by the military. And that is, she was at the peak of her activism, and that's when she was just picked up from her home one night, and nobody knows what happened to her after that. So I think a lot of this still exists. A lot of my indigenous friends, like when the pandemic started and there was lockdown, a lot of my indigenous women friends who went out, they would hear like, পাহাড়ি আসছে, করোনা ছড়াবে, or চাকমা আসছে, ওর কাছ থেকে আমাদের, ওরা তো pig খায় এর জন্য. So they are angry. And I think the point that I'm trying to put emphasis on here is that এই যে racismটা that is happening in our country, এই যে একটা particular race বা different races of মানুষ who are the minority, এরা যে বাস করতেছে আমাদের চারপাশে, এটার কোনো acknowledgementই নাই আসলে, let alone their anger or let alone the violence that's happening to them. There is no acknowledgement of their existence. There is no acknowledgement of the ways they had to survive for generations in the face of this violence.
Yeah. And Mane, and when you were speaking about একদম প্রথমে in what spaces is feminine rage kind of allowed, and if it's a room full of women, and then obviously you are allowed to speak about things that you are angry about, versus if you're in a room full of men and you're the only woman, then you have a lot less scope for that. And I feel like with indigenous women, because it's going up against patriarchy, it's also going up against nationalism, it's also going up against Bengali settler colonialism. It's just, there's just like their scope is just like the smallest, even though it should be the absolute biggest.
And so much feminist anger or feminine rage went into sort of establishing a lot of movements and what led to those movements, right? So Sufia Kamal and Begum Ruqya, whom we've already discussed, are pioneers of women's education and agency in Bangladeshi society. Sufia Kamal also took part in various movements like the language movement and the mass upsurge of the 1969. And she was a literary activist, not just somebody who went out in the streets and spoke about women's rights. Same goes for Begum Ruqya. Her radical feminist piece, Sultana's Dream, is still something that is considered good academic sort of resource for young feminists, right? So their struggles and their expressions of rage helped shape the present society that we know, helped shape the society where women are being able to reside with their heads held up high. And we wouldn't have this if these women did not take part in movements. There is a general dislike for movements and protests in our liberal thinking, liberal politically sort of political people with liberal political mindset. But if there weren't movements, what brought these social changes? If these women weren't getting angry, how did we become aware that women even need education or women even need agency in society or family?
Absolutely.
I think this reminded me of a quote that I really like. Audre Lorde said, anger is loaded with information and energy. So when we talk about, these women were angry and that is why they realized that other girls need to be educated, like we need to remember that anger isn't just, you can't just isolate it as an emotion that makes you irrational or something. No, anger also has a lot of power to it, the power to bring change and the power to see things more clearly, the power to demand for change especially.
And the power for it to become clear to you that, no, something is upsetting me, something is happening to me that I don't want to happen, and something is wrong that I want to, that is causing me this anger that I want to do something about. And I feel like, even for me personally, just reading reading these pieces of work of feminists and feminists of color have helped me so much in owning my feminine rage and helping me know that, okay, when I'm angry about something, I know that it's rooted in knowing what my boundaries are. It's rooted in knowing what my rights are, and then I demand it because I'm angry about it. And I feel like, I think Audre Lorde is also someone that speaks about anger as like a feminist tool and a feminist resource. And that is something, I've been able to really, really apply to my life. And I'm so thankful.
I think
I
that is
think
why
it
it's
will also be, sorry, go
yeah.
on.
No,
No,
like
sorry, go
that's
on.
it. That's it. Like, because it is a feminist tool, it's so shunned out and vilified because it scares, it threatens the system, it threatens men. That's it.
Yeah.
Please go on.
Yeah, I was going to say that like we shouldn't be reducing feminist anger to just try and understand how it has improved women's lives, but that a lot of women have had contributions in setting up democracies, in talking about problems of nationalism, and in sort of identifying other structural problems around us, which is not just patriarchy. Like, if I bring up examples of women of color, Gloria Anzaldúa is a very good example of somebody who was born in the American Mexican border, the Texan Mexican border, and she saw firsthand what the problems of borders existing could be. She's a Chicana queer feminist theorist and a poet, a literary activist, and her work is so important to understand marginalization of not just Mexican folks in America, but also people of other color in America, and especially Mexican women, and how the book is called Borderlands, for just for reference. So there's examples of such women of color whose struggles have not just laid out the problems of patriarchy bare to us, but they've also sort of, in their course of work, challenged bigger problems like the ones that state poses for its citizens, or the ones that borders can pose for people who are living within these borders, right? And of course, women of color have had so much impact in the civil rights movement in America, the trans rights activism, and the Stonewall riot. Those were all led and they had really heavy participation of women, and women have had huge contributions in shaping changes which were led to by these movements.
Yeah, and if we speak about even the Black Lives Matter movement, that that very recently just became prominent with the murder of George Floyd. The Black Lives Matter movement was founded by three queer Black women, and I feel like people don't. And there is also, it was founded by them, but over the course of the movement, even Black women now have rage against Black men that kind of deny the oppression within the communities that they face. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's not that women or queer people have laid the path just for people like them, but just for everybody in general.
That line of thought, we can't reduce women's feminine anger to just these political movements that you said that target patriarchy. We should also remember that since we're talking about both private and political spheres, that we also can't reduce feminine anger, feminine rage to only when it led to certain social changes, to only when it caused movements or participated in certain movements. Feminine anger or our anger individually is also extremely valid, and we also need to talk about how when we have like one-on-one interactions or all of that, and we're angry in those circles, those are also important and should be acknowledged and talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, yeah, like I don't have to be mad about, generations of my kind that have faced injustice. I can be mad about something really dumb and stupid, but you still have to listen to that anger.
Yeah. Because even in these small circles, right, like anger is kind of reduced or shunned out. Like I was talking to Mama about this earlier. Like a girl tells her boyfriend that she's angry about something, and he's like, "You're cute when you're mad."
Yeah. No, I'm mad when I'm mad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or the crazy ex-girlfriend trope when they're like giving valid accusations and all of that. Just, the hysterical, overly possessive wife trope. I mean, there are so many ways in which anger is kind of reduced or humiliated or just not given the validation that it should be in our own circles.
Yeah. Mane, the thing that I was saying, Protome, it strengthens men or masculine folks, and then at the same time weakens women and femme folks. All right. Anything? I feel like we've covered quite a lot. Any point, Ahir, that you think that we didn't really touch on?
No, we touched upon a lot. I'm kind of trying to think. We talked about, if we could just kind of revise the things that we went through. We talked about what feminine rage is, how it's gendered, how if a man is angry, it's like, is there assertive and scary and even like admirable when they're in positions of power, but when it's a woman being angry, it's looked down upon and all of that. We talked about how feminine rage exists in private and political spheres and how both of those really aren't separate entities, how they constantly influence each other, and that is why it's kind of important to acknowledge that our private experiences have like bigger political consequences. We also, I think my favorite part of the podcast was we also talked about who is allowed to be angry, where we also, I'm just kind of revising to remind the audience the things that we've been through. So if you guys want to add to it, please do. It's just, yeah.
No, you're covering everything.
We talked about who is allowed to be angry. So in there, we talked about how even though feminine rage isn't really accepted for anyone, there's even in that regard, there are classes about how upper class, educated, and the bhalome trope, there's another, the bhalome characteristics, when they're angry or when they express their frustration, that's something that's more accepted. We talked about men kind of separating themselves from other men who are abusers and kind of not seeing them in the same light. We also talked about how when when in certain spaces where other women are present, it's much easier to express that rage. But when you're one woman in a room full of men, it's harder. So that's obviously a simplified version. Yeah, we also talked about, lastly, we talked about how feminist rage kind of manifested in our political spheres, the impacts that it had on our communities, especially how sometimes we really forget, we really don't feel the need to be a feminist. Not me personally, but like a lot of people can kind of like come up with that. But we forget that even the things that we take for granted today, we think that are normal, like right to vote, it happened because, someone decided to break stuff because they were angry at the injustice. And yeah, I think if there's one takeaway that I had from this episode, is the fact that anger creates change. We really need to hammer down on the fact. I feel like that's why it's so easy to kind of vilify, not only because it's seen as not feminine or not desirable, those exist, but also because it is so terrifying to the existing structure. And that is why it is important for them to kind of ostracize it. Because yeah, it wreaks havoc and causes chaos. Do you guys have anything to add to that? Something we talked about that you feel like we should remind the audience of?
Yeah, I think just that, women's struggles have not only been about women's issues, but that it has been about overarching other structural issues that touches everybody's life. So we owe a lot of other changes to women's struggles as well.
Mama?
Yeah, I mean, this is not like something we've talked about. I think I was just thinking about when you talked about like how it manifests and creates change. One thing that we didn't talk about in depth was the garments workers movement in Bangladesh, which, that again, because of who is angry, it's not seen as, it's not considered when we think about, okay, what have been the feminist movements in Bangladesh, but that very much is integral and central to the feminist movement in Bangladesh. And they're fighting for equal wages. They're fighting for, they're fighting against harassment and violence in the workplace. They're fighting against capitalism, against women who are in power that's not denying them basic rights as working class women. And, there's so much to learn from from this particular movement, even about how to organize, and they have been successful, right? They didn't get increases in their wages because somebody decided, okay, I'm in a good mood, let's give them more wages. They were able to get that because they were out on the streets for days and weeks, and they were angry, and they demanded, that you have to pay us fair wages. You have to, even during the pandemic, we've seen them out on the streets demanding no layoffs, demanding they pay the due wages, that they take care of their workers during a health crisis. Like if we didn't see that anger out on the streets so visible, so in your face, then we wouldn't even consider those things to be worried about. And I feel like that's why this anger is so powerful, because it's in your face and it denies you the ability to be ignorant about it.
And the person who kind of spearheaded the movement for
I,
sexual harassment is
yeah, we can hear you now. We couldn't hear you properly তখন এখন শোনা যাচ্ছে.
Oh, okay. I was saying that even the person who kind of spearheaded the movement for sexual harassment in the garment sector that you were talking about, she's called Dolly Akhtar. She was a garments worker herself. And it is because she got angry after she was abused that she took to the street and she mobilized these groups of women to come out and protest. And that's incredible. Like how much power emotion has. Like we keep trying to kind of separate emotion from politics, but we really achieve nothing by that. Emotions and anger drive these women, drive people to ask for change. And yeah, I just wanted to bring up her.
Yeah, and I think you brought up a good point about like trying to remove emotion from political work, and that's absolutely not the right way to go. Durdana, were you saying something? Sorry, did I cut you off?
Not really, but I think I did want to touch upon the point that, it's not just patriarchy that women fought against, but also things like racism and caste and
Capitalism.
colorism. And caste and colorism is very much related to our South Asian history. So I think those are some things that haven't been mentioned in the wider discussion. So I just want to mention that.
Yeah.
Yeah, or like so many, as you were talking about during the language movement, we only heard these men's name. Like so many freedom fighters were women, but we never really learned about them. We never really got to see them as the heroes that we got to see like other men. Because, you know, they took up arms and fought for our nation as well, but we just, that depiction of women just it doesn't exist for a lot of us.
Yeah. And I feel like it's because it's so difficult for us to equate an angry woman as someone to be idolized, someone to be inspired by. But I don't know how you can be not inspired by angry, loud women. Like I don't understand that. All right. Did we any last thoughts as we wrap up today?
I want to say to the people watching this, please continue to be the one angry feminist that angers everyone. I mean,
we were talking about the term feminazi before this, right? Like just feminazi shesh. Like no, even if it's just in your classroom or even if it's just in your group of friends, keep being angry. You should be angry. You're supposed to be angry. That is only natural. It's nothing that you should be ashamed of or something that you should seen as like, you know, ugly or undesirable. No, it's perfect. It's empowering. Find the power in your anger and learn to channel it by standing up for what you believe in. It doesn't even have to be feminism. It just has to be anything that you believe in. Learn to kind of channel your anger constructively for that, because you're allowed that anger. You deserve that anger. That's it. Very sentimental conclusion. Do you guys have any similar emotional outbursts to, like, you know, give?
Yeah, I could really relate to that one line by Sara Ahmed. I think, if I'm not wrong, she's a Pakistani feminist and women's rights advocate. She said that I'm that woman who ruins your dinner table conversation or something like that.
Yeah.
I can really relate to that a lot.
Yeah.
Because, you know, it brings to focus like the sort of hush-hush things you're not supposed to talk about with your family members, but maybe it has impacted your life so much. So, you know, bringing that up with the family members and just ruining the dinner. I think that's one form of rage, definitely.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think you guys covered it like pretty perfectly. Yeah, I would just end by saying, you know, you're never annoying enough, and you're never like too loud when you're being angry. You're being exactly who you're supposed to be. So yeah, hold on to that anger. That's all I would say.
Our episode is drawing to an end. I just want to thank both of you for being here. This was very, very empowering and inspiring, and a lot of fun actually to learn so much. And I know that everyone watching this also learned a lot. So thank you, Mama. Thank you, Durdana, for being here, for joining Not Here for an episode. At last, just want to say that we are here for Feminine Rage. That's it, guys. Bye. Don't forget to like and subscribe.
You're one of those YouTubers now, I hear. You just have to embrace it. Okay, bye everybody. Thank you for joining us.
Bye, guys.
Thank you for listening.